Our first story comes from someone who learned that sometimes the person you think you know best can surprise you in the most unexpected ways. I thought my boyfriend was cheating, so I hired a private investigator. Turns out he was planning the most elaborate surprise I've ever seen. My boyfriend Jake and I have been together for 2 years, and honestly, things have been pretty great until about 3 months ago, when everything started feeling off. He'd disappear for hours without explanation. His phone was always face down, and he'd get these mysterious calls that he'd take in another room. I'm not usually the paranoid type, but when someone you love starts acting like they're living a double life, your mind goes to dark places. The breaking point came when I saw a charge on our shared credit card for something called Moonlight Events for $800. When I asked him about it, he got defensive and said it was a work thing. But Jake works in IT support. There's no way his company would reimburse him for anything that expensive, let alone something called Moonlight Events. I spent 3 sleepless nights convinced he was having an affair. So I did what any rational person would do. I hired a private investigator. Her name was Detective Rodriguez, and she specialized in infidelity cases. I felt sick handing over the retainer, but I needed to know the truth. She said she'd have answers within a week, and that most cases like this confirm what the client already suspects. Day 1 of surveillance, she followed him to work normal. Day 2, he went to lunch with his co-workers, then stopped at Home Depot, nothing suspicious. Day 3 is when things got interesting. He drove to an address across town, went inside for 2 hours, then came out carrying what looked like fabric samples. Detective Rodriguez took photos, but couldn't get close enough to see details. Day 4, he met with someone at a coffee shop, a woman I didn't recognize. They talked for an hour looking at papers spread across their table. My heart sank when I saw the photos. This was it, the proof I'd been dreading. But Detective Rodriguez said something felt off about their body language. They weren't sitting close. They weren't touching it. Looked more like a business meeting than a romantic one. Day 5. Jake took a half day off work and drove to 3 different locations, a florist, a bakery, and something called Sterling Rentals. Detective Rodriguez managed to get close enough at the bakery to overhear him asking about cake tastings for 50 people. My mind was racing. 50 people. For what a wedding with his secret girlfriend. By day 6, I was a wreck. I'd barely eaten or slept. I kept imagining confronting him, demanding answers, maybe throwing his stuff on the lawn, like they do in movies. Detective Rodriguez called me that evening and said she had everything I needed to know, but her voice sounded strange. Almost amused, she asked if I could meet her the next morning to go over everything. I showed up at her office, prepared for the worst. She had a thick folder of photos and notes laid out on her desk, but instead of looking grim, she was smiling. She slid the first photo across the desk. It was Jake at Moonlight Events, which turned out to be an event planning company, not a hotel or anything shady. Then came photos of him meeting with a caterer, a florist, and a musician. Detective Rodriguez leaned back in her chair and said, "Your boyfriend isn't cheating. He's planning what looks like the most elaborate surprise party I've ever seen." She showed me more photos. Jake looking at venues, talking to photographers, even meeting with someone who appeared to be a videographer. The woman at the coffee shop wasn't his mistress, she was a party planner. Apparently, our 2-year anniversary was coming up in 3 weeks and Jake had been secretly organising a surprise celebration. He'd invited both our families, all our friends, and even tracked down my college roommate who moved to Seattle last year. The $800 charge was a deposit for the venue. Everything else, food, flowers, music, decorations, was coming out of his personal savings account. I sat there staring at the evidence, feeling like the worst girlfriend in human history. While I'd been imagining him sneaking around with another woman, he'd been planning the sweetest gesture anyone had ever done for me. Detective Rodriguez handed me tissues and said, "This happens more than you'd think." People planning surprises often look exactly like people having affairs. The hardest part was pretending I didn't know. For the next 3 weeks, Jake kept disappearing for mysterious errands, and I had to act annoyed instead of grateful. Every time he took a secretive phone call, I wanted to hug him and apologize for doubting him, but I couldn't blow his surprise. The night of our anniversary, Jake told me we were going to dinner at our usual place, but when we pulled up to the venue instead, he looked nervous and said he had a small surprise waiting inside. When I walked through those doors and saw everyone I loved cheering and celebrating us, I broke down crying. Jake thought something was wrong until I told him they were happy tears. I never told him about the private investigator. Some secrets are worth keeping, but I did tell Detective Rodriguez that her services led to one of the happiest nights of my life. She said that was a first in her line of work and that she'd never had a case with such a perfect ending. Well, that's a plot twist I wasn't expecting. Imagine hiring someone to catch your partner cheating only to discover they're planning the surprise of a lifetime. This poor person spent weeks convinced they were being betrayed when really they were being loved harder than they realized. Sometimes paranoia and romance look exactly the same. From the outside, it makes you wonder how many relationships end because of misunderstood phone calls and mysterious errands. Speaking of misunderstandings, our next story involves someone who thought they were being ghosted, but the reality was far more complicated. I got ghosted after the best date of my life. Then I found out why and everything changed. I met Riley on a dating app and we hit it off immediately. Not just the usual small talk, but real conversations about books, travel, dreams, the kind of connection that makes you forget you're talking to a stranger. We texted constantly for 2 weeks before finally meeting up for coffee that turned into dinner, that turned into walking around the city until 2 a.m. talking about everything and nothing. The date was perfect, and I don't use that word lightly. We had the same sense of humour, similar values, and this easy chemistry that felt natural. Never forced. When Riley walked me to my car, we kissed. And it was one of those movie moments where time stops and the world disappears. We made plans for the following weekend. I went home floating on cloud 9, convinced I'd just met someone special. Then nothing complete, radio silence. I texted the next day, asking if they got home safely, no response. I waited 3 days and sent a casual message about a funny meme. We talked about nothing. I called once, and it went straight to voicemail. After a week of being ignored, I got the message loud and clear. I'd been ghosted. It stung more than usual rejections because everything had felt so genuine. The conversation, the laughter, the way Riley looked at me like I was the most interesting person in the room. Either I'd completely misread the situation, or they were an incredible actor. Either way, I felt stupid for believing we had something real. I went through all the stages of being ghosted. First denial, checking my phone every 5 minutes, wondering if my messages weren't going through. Then anger. How could someone seem so genuine and then just disappear? Then bargaining. Maybe they lost their phone. Maybe they were dealing with a family emergency. Finally, acceptance. Some people are just cowards who can't handle adult conversations about not being interested. 2 months later, I was at a bookstore browsing the mystery section when I heard someone call my name. I turned around and there was Riley looking exactly the same, but somehow different, older, maybe more tired. They approached cautiously, like they weren't sure I'd want to talk to them, which honestly, I wasn't sure I did either. Riley asked if we could talk somewhere private, and despite my better judgment, I agreed. We went to a quiet corner of the store, and they started explaining what happened the night of our date. Riley had gone home and found their ex waiting in the apartment. Apparently, they'd been broken up for 6 months, but the ex had kept a key and had been showing up unannounced, trying to reconcile. That night, the ex saw Riley come home, clearly happy and glowing, and demanded to know where they'd been when Riley mentioned going on a date. The ex lost it completely, screaming threats saying they'd make sure Riley never dated anyone else. There was pushing, shoving, and Riley ended up with a black eye and bruised ribs. The ex took Riley's phone and started going through messages. When they saw our conversation, they became even more unhinged, threatening to find me and make me pay for stealing their person. Riley tried to get the phone back, but the ex smashed it against the wall. then left with a promise to be watching. Riley spent the next day at the police station, filing a restraining order, but the damage was done. They were terrified that staying in contact with me would put me in danger, so they made the painful decision to cut all communication. They changed their number, moved to a different apartment, and tried to rebuild their life while dealing with the trauma. As Riley told me this story, I could see the pain in their eyes, the guilt over how they'd handled things, but also the genuine fear that had driven their decision. They'd been protecting me in the only way they knew how, even though it meant sacrificing something that could have been beautiful between us. They apologized over and over, explaining that they'd thought about reaching out so many times, but didn't know how to explain the situation without sounding crazy or dragging me into their mess. They'd finally gotten their life back on track. The ex was in jail for violating the restraining order, and Riley felt safe enough to live normally again. I didn't know what to say. Part of me was angry that they'd made the decision for both of us without giving me a choice, but a bigger part of me understood the impossible position they'd been in. How do you tell someone you barely know that dating you might put them in physical danger? How do you risk someone else's safety for your own happiness? We talked for hours in that bookstore, sharing everything that had happened in those 2 months apart. Riley had started therapy to deal with the trauma and fear I'd dated other people, but never felt the same connection we'd had that night. It was strange and sad and hopeful all at once. Riley asked if there was any chance we could try again, start over with honesty this time. No secrets, no protection, just two people seeing where things could go. I said yes, not because I wasn't hurt by being ghosted, but because I understood why it happened, and I respected the courage it took to find me and explain. We're taking things slow now, building trust and communication in ways we didn't have time to before that first date. Our second first date was just as magical as the original, but deeper somehow, more real, because we both knew how precious and fragile connection can be. Sometimes being ghosted isn't about you at all. Sometimes it's about someone trying to protect you from a danger you don't even know exists. This story reminds me that there's always another side to every situation, and that the people who hurt us aren't always the villains we make them out to be. Sometimes they're just scared people making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. It takes real courage to come back and explain, especially when you know the other person has every right to be angry. Our next story takes us into territory that's both heartwarming and slightly terrifying, depending on how you look at it. My stalker turned out to be my guardian angel, and I don't know how to feel about it. I'm a 24-year-old woman living alone in Chicago, and for the past 8 months I've been dealing with what I thought was a textbook stalker situation. It started small, like most of these things do, random flowers left at my apartment door with no note. Then I'd catch glimpses of the same person in a red hoodie standing across the street from my building, always just far enough away that I couldn't make out their face. The sightings became more frequent and more unsettling. I'd see red hoodie at the coffee shop where I get my morning latte sitting in the corner booth. With a newspaper held up high, I'd spot them at the grocery store, always 2 aisles over, pretending to study cereal boxes while I shopped for produce. It felt like everywhere I went this person was watching, and it was making me paranoid and exhausted. I started documenting everything, taking photos when I could, writing down times and locations in a notebook that I kept by my bed. I called the police twice, but without any direct threats or contact. They said there wasn't much they could do except file a report and suggest I vary my routine, which I tried, but Chicago isn't that big, and my life has patterns: work, gym, home, repeat. Things escalated 3 months ago when I found a manila envelope slipped under my door. Inside were printed screenshots of my social media accounts, not just the public stuff, but photos I thought were private settings, ones from years ago that I'd forgotten existed. There was also a timeline of my daily schedule written in neat handwriting with scary accuracy. 7:15 a.m. leaves for work via Red Line 6:30. p.m. stops at Whole Foods on Tuesdays. 9 p.m. yoga class on Thursdays and Saturdays. That's when I really freaked out. I changed all my passwords, made my social media completely private, installed new locks and a security camera by my front door. I even started carrying pepper spray and taking different routes to work every day. But the feeling of being watched never went away. If anything, it got stronger, like whoever this was had doubled down on their surveillance. The breaking point came 6 weeks ago. I was walking home from a late dinner with friends, around 11 p.m. when I noticed footsteps behind me, matching my pace. I turned down a side street and the footsteps followed. I sped up, they sped up. My heart was pounding as I ducked into an alley, hoping to lose them, or at least get a good look at who was following me. That's when I saw him. Not red hoodie, but a different guy. Completely. Someone I'd never seen before. And he was definitely following me with intent that wasn't good. He was bigger than me, moving with purpose, and when he saw me notice him, he didn't even try to pretend otherwise. He just smiled this cold, predatory smile and started walking faster toward me. I was trapped in the alley, with nowhere to go, when suddenly Red Hoodie appeared out of nowhere, stepping between me and the man who'd been following me. What happened next was like something out of a movie. Red Hoodie knew exactly how to handle the situation, speaking in a calm but authoritative voice, telling the other guy to back off and keep walking. The predator guy tried to argue at first, claiming he was just walking home, but Red Hoodie wasn't having it. They stood their ground, never raising their voice, but somehow commanding respect and authority after what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 minutes. The threat walked away, muttering under his breath about minding your own business. Red Hoodie turned to me, and I finally got a good look at their face. It was a woman, maybe mid-30s, with kind eyes and prematurely grey hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked tired but alert, like someone who'd been awake for too long but was still focused. She asked if I was okay, if I needed help getting home safely. I was so confused and shaken that I just stood there staring at her. This person I'd been terrified of for months had just saved me from what could have been a very dangerous situation. She seemed to understand my shock and confusion because she sighed deeply and said, "We need to talk." We went to a 24-hour diner a few blocks away, and she bought me coffee and a piece of pie while I tried to process what was happening. She introduced herself as Detective Lauren Martinez, retired Chicago PD, now working private security. She'd been hired 8 months ago to keep an eye on me. Apparently my father, whom I haven't spoken to in over 3 years, had been receiving anonymous threats about me. Someone had been sending him photos of me going about my daily life, along with messages saying they knew where I lived, where I worked, what my routines were, and that something bad was going to happen to me soon. My father, being my father, had tried calling me first, but my number was still blocked from our last big fight, so he'd hired Detective Martinez to watch over me. Without my knowledge, he'd instructed her to stay invisible unless there was immediate danger, and to document everything in case the police needed evidence later. She showed me copies of the threatening messages sent to my father, and they were genuinely terrifying, detailed descriptions of violence mixed with intimate knowledge of my life. The sender knew things that even close friends didn't know, like the fact that I have a small scar on my left shoulder from a childhood accident, or that I always order my coffee with oat milk, not regular milk. Detective Martinez had been tracking the source of the threats while simultaneously protecting me. She'd identified 3 potential suspects, including the man who'd followed me into the alley tonight, who turned out to be someone I'd briefly dated last year and blocked on all platforms after he became possessive and aggressive. She'd also been the one leaving flowers at my door, not as a stalker gesture, but as a way to check if anyone else had been there. The flowers were her calling card to let her know if my building's security had been compromised. The manila envelope with my information wasn't meant to scare me. It was meant to show me how much personal data was available online, so I'd be more careful about privacy settings. I sat in that diner booth, feeling like my entire reality had shifted. This woman I'd been terrified of had been protecting me this whole time, while I'd been documenting her movements and calling her a stalker. She'd been documenting actual threats against my life, and keeping me safe from people who wanted to hurt me. The hardest part was learning that my father, who I'd written off as controlling and manipulative, had been genuinely worried about my safety, worried enough to spend thousands of dollars hiring professional protection without asking for credit or reconciliation. He just wanted me to be safe. Even if I never spoke to him again, Detective Martinez said the case was mostly resolved. Now 2 of the 3 suspects had been arrested, and the 3rd had moved out of state after being questioned by police. She recommended I stay vigilant for a few more months, but felt confident that the immediate threat was over. I asked her why she'd revealed herself tonight, instead of just scaring off the guy and disappearing again. She said, because he was escalating beyond what she could handle alone, and because she thought I deserved to know the truth about what had been happening. She'd been watching me live in fear for months and felt guilty about adding to my stress, even though she was actually keeping me safe. We exchanged contact information, and she promised to send me regular updates about the case. She also suggested I consider reaching out to my father, not necessarily to reconcile, but to thank him for caring enough to protect me, even when we weren't speaking. That was 6 weeks ago, and I'm still processing everything I did call my father, and we had the most honest conversation we'd had in years. We're not suddenly best friends again, but we're talking, and that's something I never thought would happen. Detective Martinez has become an unlikely friend. She checks in with me regularly and has taught me practical safety skills that make me feel more confident navigating the city. Knowing the difference between paranoia and actual intuition has been life-changing. Sometimes the person you think is your biggest threat is actually your greatest protector, and sometimes the people who love you find ways to keep you safe. Even when you've pushed them away, this whole experience taught me that my instincts about being watched were completely correct. I just had the wrong idea about who was doing the watching and why. What an absolute mind-bender of a situation. Can you imagine spending months terrified of someone who was literally risking their safety to protect yours? That father deserves some serious credit for swallowing his pride and hiring protection without expecting anything in return. And Detective Martinez sounds like exactly the kind of person you'd want watching your back. The fact that she revealed herself to prevent escalation shows real professionalism and compassion. This story makes you wonder how many other mysterious situations in our lives might have completely different explanations than what we assume, speaking of assumptions that turn out to be completely wrong. Our next story involves someone who discovered that their partner's secret hobby was both innocent and absolutely bizarre. I thought my girlfriend was having an affair because she kept sneaking out at night. Turns out she's been living a double life as a competitive juggler. My girlfriend Zoe and I have been together for almost 2 years, and she's always been a little quirky, but about 4 months ago she started acting really strange. She'd get mysterious text messages that would make her smile. In this secretive way, she'd started going to bed later and waking up earlier, and most suspiciously, she'd begun leaving the apartment at weird hours with a gym bag. At first I didn't think much of it. Maybe she'd joined a new fitness class or started meeting up with co-workers for early morning runs. But when I casually asked about her new routine, she'd get vague and change the subject, saying it was just something she was trying out, nothing serious. The secrecy started eating at me, especially when I noticed she'd been doing laundry more frequently, and her gym bag always smelled like rosin, which I recognised from my high school theatre days, when we used it on our hands for better grip during rope climbing. I couldn't figure out why Zoe would need rosin for a workout. Things got weirder when I found a receipt in her jeans pocket for something called Spinner's Paradise, which sounded like either a laundromat or a place I really didn't want to know about when I googled it. The website was vague, just mentioning equipment and supplies for enthusiasts, with no clear indication of what kind of enthusiasts they were catering to. The final straw came when I woke up at 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and realised Zoe wasn't in bed. I checked the living room, thinking maybe she couldn't sleep and was watching TV, but she was nowhere in the apartment. Her keys were gone, her gym bag was gone, and her phone went straight to voicemail when I called. I stayed awake until she came home around 5:30 a.m, looking exhausted, but also weirdly energised, like someone who just finished an intense workout or an intense something else. When I asked where she'd been, she said she was just getting some fresh air and needed to clear her head. Then she kissed my forehead and went straight to the shower. That's when I started really spiraling. What kind of fresh air do you need at 3 a.m. with a gym bag that smells like rosin? I began paying closer attention to her behaviour and noticed she'd started stretching more, doing these weird hand and wrist exercises while watching TV, and she'd gotten noticeably better at catching things when she dropped them like unnaturally good. I also noticed she'd been watching YouTube videos on her laptop with headphones in, and when I tried to peek over her shoulder, she'd quickly close the browser or switch to something else. The few glimpses I caught looked like instructional videos, but I couldn't tell for what. My paranoid brain went to the worst possible places. Maybe she was seeing someone else. Maybe these late-night excursions were elaborate cover stories for affairs. Maybe the gym bag contained things I didn't want to think about. I started imagining confrontations and accusations and dramatic breakup scenes. But I also felt guilty for not trusting her. Zoe had never given me any real reason to doubt her loyalty. She was affectionate, attentive, and seemed genuinely happy in our relationship, except for this new mysterious behaviour that had started consuming more and more of her time and energy. I decided to follow her one night, which I know sounds terrible, but I was desperate for answers. I waited until she thought I was asleep, then quietly got dressed and followed her car to a community centre about 20 minutes from our apartment. The parking lot was surprisingly full for 2 a.m, and I could hear music and voices coming from inside. I crept around to a window, and what I saw inside blew my mind. There were about 30 people of all ages juggling everything you could imagine. Balls, clubs, rings, even flaming torches. Some were practicing alone. Others were performing routines in groups, and right in the centre of it all was Zoe juggling 5 balls in a pattern so complex it looked like magic. I stood there watching my girlfriend, who I thought might be cheating on me, absolutely dominating what appeared to be some kind of underground juggling club. She was good, like really, really good. People were stopping their own practice to watch her routine, and when she finished, they actually applauded. I snuck back to my car and drove home in a daze, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. My girlfriend wasn't having an affair. She was secretly becoming a professional juggler, which somehow felt almost as shocking as if she had been cheating. Why hadn't she told me about this obvious passion and talent? The next morning I confronted her gently, asking if there was anything she wanted to share with me about her new hobbies. She looked panicked for a moment, then sighed deeply and asked how long I'd known I told her about following her the night before, and she actually laughed with relief. Apparently, Zoe had been juggling since she was a kid, but had always been embarrassed about it. She thought people would find it weird or childish, so she'd kept it secret even from me. But a few months ago, she'd discovered the late-night juggling club and fallen back in love with the art form. She'd been practicing obsessively, preparing for a regional competition that could qualify her for nationals. She hadn't told me because she was afraid I'd think it was silly, or that I'd pressure her to quit if it started taking up too much time. She wanted to see how far she could take it before involving anyone else in her juggling dreams. I felt like such an idiot for assuming the worst when the reality was so much more innocent and actually pretty amazing. She showed me some of her routines right there in our living room, and I was genuinely impressed by her skill and dedication. She ended up placing second in the regional competition and qualified for nationals, where she made it to the semi-finals. We've turned our spare bedroom into a practice space, and I've become her biggest supporter, even learning to juggle myself, though I'm nowhere near her level. Now I go to competitions with her, and I've met this whole community of juggling enthusiasts who are some of the most welcoming and passionate people I've ever encountered. What I thought was suspicious behaviour was actually my girlfriend pursuing excellence in something she loved. Sometimes the secrets people keep aren't betrayals, they're just parts of themselves. They're not ready to share yet. And sometimes the most innocent explanations are the ones we never consider, because our minds automatically go to the worst case scenario. I'm glad I followed her that night, but I'm even more glad I asked her about it directly, instead of letting my paranoia destroy our relationship. This is absolutely delightful. Instead of discovering an affair, she discovered her girlfriend is basically a circus performer. In disguise, the fact that there's an entire underground juggling community meeting at 2 a.m. sounds like the plot of the most wholesome secret society movie ever made. And honestly good for Zoe for pursuing her passion, even if she was initially embarrassed about it. There's something beautiful about someone dedicating themselves to mastering an art form, just for the love of it. Plus now, they have the coolest party trick as a couple. Imagine the dinner parties where Zoe just casually starts juggling the silverware. Our final story tonight comes from someone who learned that sometimes the most romantic gestures come disguised as the most annoying problems. My upstairs neighbour has been driving me crazy with noise complaints for 6 months. Turns out he was trying to get my attention because he's in love with me. I moved into my current apartment last January, and it's been mostly great, except for my upstairs neighbour, who I was convinced was either the most inconsiderate person alive or actively trying to drive me insane. It started with noise complaints. He'd knock on my door at random times claiming I was being too loud with my music, my TV, even my footsteps. The first few times I tried to be understanding and accommodating, I'd turn down my music, apologise for any disturbance, and promise to be more mindful. But the complaints kept coming, even when I was barely making any noise at all. He'd show up claiming my cooking was too loud, or that my phone conversations were disturbing his sleep. What made it especially frustrating was that his complaints never seemed to follow any logical pattern. Sometimes he'd knock at 7 p.m. saying my dinner preparation was too noisy. Other times he'd wait until 10 p.m. to complain about sounds. I'd made hours earlier. It felt random and excessive, like he was just looking for reasons to bother me. I started keeping a log of every interaction, thinking maybe I could identify patterns or prove to building management that his complaints were unreasonable. But the more I documented, the weirder it got. Sometimes he'd complain about noise. When I hadn't even been home other times, he'd knock and then seem to forget why he was there, just standing in my doorway, looking nervous. The breaking point came last month when he knocked at 6 a.m, claiming my alarm clock was too loud. When I pointed out that my alarm was set to vibrate only, and that sound doesn't travel downward through floors anyway. He just stood there looking embarrassed and said maybe he'd made a mistake. That's when I really started paying attention to him as a person, rather than just an annoyance. His name was David, and he was probably in his early 30s, tall and lanky, with the kind of messy hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it. He always seemed nervous around me, fidgeting with his keys or his phone while making his complaints. I also noticed that his complaints had started coming more frequently on weekends and evenings when I was more likely to be home, and that he never seemed actually angry about the noise, just awkward and apologetic, like he didn't really want to be having these conversations, but felt compelled to anyway. One Saturday afternoon, I was doing laundry in the basement when I overheard David talking to Mrs. Chen from 3B. She was asking him about his noise complaints, and he was trying to explain that he wasn't really bothered by noise. He just didn't know how else to talk to me. Mrs. Chen, being the wise elderly woman, she has asked him why he didn't just introduce himself like a normal person. I couldn't hear his full response, but I caught enough to understand that he was shy and had convinced himself that complaining about noise was a legitimate reason to start conversations with me, even though he knew most of his complaints were ridiculous. He apparently had what Mrs. Chen called a schoolboy crush and was handling it like a schoolboy. Everything suddenly made perfect sense. The random timing, the nervous fidgeting, the way he'd linger in my doorway, like he wanted to say something else, but couldn't find the words. David wasn't trying to drive me crazy, he was trying to get my attention, because he liked me and had no idea how to express it. Normally I felt a mix of emotions, annoyed that he'd been bothering me for months, but also kind of flattered that someone had gone to such awkward lengths just to spend a few minutes talking to me. It was like the adult version of pulling pigtails on the playground, completely misguided but oddly sweet. That evening I decided to take matters into my own hands. I baked a batch of cookies and went upstairs to knock on his door. When he answered, he looked panicked, like he'd been caught doing something wrong. I handed him the cookies and said I'd brought them to apologise for being such a noisy neighbour. The poor guy turned bright red and started stammering about how I wasn't really that noisy, and maybe he'd been too sensitive about sound, and he was sorry for bothering me so much. I let him fumble through his apology, then asked if he wanted to have coffee sometime to discuss better ways to handle neighbour disputes. His face lit up like I'd just offered him $1 million. He said yes immediately, then asked if I was sure I wanted to have coffee with someone who'd been such a pain. About noise complaints. I told him I was willing to overlook his unconventional conversation starters if he promised to just knock and say hi next time. We had coffee that Sunday, and it turned out David was actually really interesting when he wasn't pretending to be upset about imaginary noise. He worked as a graphic designer, loved hiking, and had been too intimidated to ask me out normally because he thought I was out of his league, and he confessed that the noise complaints had started as genuine concerns, but had quickly become excuses to see me when he realised he had a crush. The 6 a.m. alarm complaint had been his rock bottom moment, when he'd panicked and knocked without thinking of a plausible reason. We've been dating for 3 weeks now, and he's turned out to be one of the sweetest, most considerate people I've ever met. He brings me coffee in the mornings, helps with my groceries, and has never once made an actual noise complaint. Sometimes, the most annoying people in our lives are just trying to connect with us in the only way they know how, and sometimes the most romantic love stories start with the most ridiculous misunderstandings. David's approach was completely backwards, but his intentions were pure, and now we have the funniest how we met story. That might be the most endearingly awkward meet-cute I've ever heard. 6 months of fake noise complaints, because this man couldn't figure out how to say hello like a normal human being. It's giving major middle school energy, but in the most charming way possible. The fact that Mrs. Chen had to basically give him a reality check about his ridiculous strategy makes it even better. And honestly, props to our storyteller for being understanding enough to see past the annoying behaviour to the sweet intentions underneath. Some people really do take the scenic route to romance. Well, there you have it, folks. Love in all its strange and wonderful forms, from private investigators revealing surprise parties, to underground juggling communities, to the world's most ineffective pickup strategy. These stories remind us that human connection is messy, complicated, and often completely different from what it appears on the surface. If you made it this far into these wild tales of romance gone sideways, consider hitting that subscribe button, because apparently you enjoy diving deep into other people's relationship chaos. And honestly, same thanks for spending part of your day with me and these beautifully bizarre love stories. I need to share one more story with you because this one absolutely floored me when I first read it, and it's about discovering that sometimes the person you're trying to help is actually the one causing all your problems. My roommate kept eating my food, so I set up a hidden camera. Turns out she was also the one leaving me anonymous care packages. I live with my roommate Becca in a 2-bedroom apartment near campus, and for the most part, we get along really well. We're both grad students, so we understand the stress of deadlines and late-night study sessions. But about 4 months ago, I started noticing my food disappearing from the fridge. Nothing dramatic at first, just little things like my leftover pizza would have one less slice than I remembered, or my yogurt would be gone when I was sure I had 2 containers left. At first I thought maybe I was just tired and forgetting what I'd eaten, but it kept happening more frequently, and with more expensive items. My fancy imported cheese would vanish. My organic almond butter would be nearly empty. When I'd barely touched it, even my meal prep containers would go missing entirely. I tried talking to Becca about it, casually mentioning that maybe we should be more careful about labelling our food, but she always seemed genuinely confused and concerned, asking if I thought someone was breaking in or if maybe I was sleepwalking and eating my own food, which honestly made me question my own sanity for a while. The situation got more frustrating when I started buying specific items for myself, like this expensive protein powder that I needed for my workouts, or special dietary foods for a health condition I was managing. These weren't just random snacks. They were things I actually needed. And when they disappeared, it affected my daily routine. I decided to set up a small hidden camera in the kitchen just to see what was happening. I ordered one of those tiny spy cameras online and tucked it behind some cookbooks on the shelf positioned so it could see the entire kitchen and fridge area. I felt weird about essentially spying on my roommate, but I needed to know if I was losing my mind or if someone was actually taking my food. The first few days of footage were boring, just me making coffee in the morning and occasionally grabbing snacks, but on day 4, I caught something interesting. Becca came into the kitchen around midnight when she thought I was asleep and went straight to the fridge. She took my leftover Thai food and ate it, standing right there in the kitchen, then carefully cleaned up any evidence. I was furious, but also relieved to know I wasn't imagining things. I kept recording for a few more days to see if it was a pattern, and sure enough, she was taking something almost every night, sometimes just a few bites of leftovers, sometimes entire meals. She'd even portion out my meal prep into smaller containers, like she was trying to make it less obvious. But here's where it gets weird. During those same few days, I'd been finding these sweet, anonymous care packages outside my bedroom door, little gift bags with study snacks, energy drinks, sometimes even flowers with notes that said things like, "Hope your research is going well," or "Thought you could use a pick-me-up." I'd assumed they were from this guy in my program, who I'd been casually flirting with, or maybe from my lab partner, who knew I was stressed about my thesis defense. The timing seemed random but thoughtful, and they always contained exactly the kind of things I needed when I was having particularly rough weeks. The care packages had been showing up for about 2 months, always when I was having a hard time or feeling overwhelmed. They never came with names. Just these encouraging little notes in handwriting. I didn't recognize it was like having a secret admirer who actually paid attention to my stress levels and knew exactly how to help. When I reviewed more of the camera footage, I discovered something that made my brain completely short-circuit. There was Becca at 2 a.m. carefully arranging a care package with items she'd bought specifically for me. I watched her write out one of those encouraging notes in deliberately disguised handwriting, then quietly place it outside my door. I sat there staring at the footage, trying to process what I was seeing. My roommate was stealing my food, but also secretly buying me gifts and leaving me anonymous encouragement. It made absolutely no sense. Why would someone take my leftovers, but then spend their own money to buy me snacks and energy drinks? I kept watching more footage and the pattern became clear. She'd take my food late at night when she thought I was asleep, but then a day or 2 later, she'd leave me a care package that often included similar items to what she'd taken. It was like she was borrowing my food and then replacing it with gifts, but without ever explaining the system. The breakthrough came when I caught her on camera, actually eating my food while preparing one of the care packages. She was stress eating my leftover Chinese takeout at 1 a.m. while carefully arranging energy bars and tea bags in a gift bag for me to find the next morning. I realised she was probably doing the same thing. I was staying up too late studying, surviving on caffeine and whatever food was convenient, and my readily available leftovers were just easier than cooking for herself at midnight. But she felt guilty about it, so she was trying to make up for it with anonymous gifts. The next morning I knocked on her door and asked if we could talk. I told her I'd set up the camera and knew about both the food disappearing and the care packages appearing. She looked mortified at first, like she'd been caught committing some terrible crime. She broke down and explained that she'd been struggling financially more than she'd let on her assistantship barely covered rent and basic groceries. So when she got hungry late at night and saw my leftovers, she'd convince herself she was just borrowing a little bit, but then she'd feel terrible about it. The care packages were her way of trying to pay me back and show appreciation without having to admit she'd been taking my food. She'd been spending money. She didn't really have to buy me gifts because she felt so guilty about eating my leftovers, but was too embarrassed to just ask if she could have some. We worked out a much better system. She pays me a small amount each month to basically share groceries and leftovers, and in return, I make sure to cook enough for both of us. When I meal prep, no more midnight food theft and no more anonymous guilt gifts, just honest communication about our needs. She still leaves me encouraging notes sometimes, but now she signs them and they're not motivated by food guilt, just genuine friendship. The whole situation taught me that sometimes people's weird behavior has perfectly logical explanations that you'd never guess. Sometimes the person causing your problems is also the person trying to solve them in the most backwards way possible. This poor girl was stuck in this elaborate cycle of food theft and guilt gifts when a simple conversation about splitting groceries would have solved everything months earlier. The fact that she was spending money she didn't have to buy apology gifts for food she was secretly borrowing is almost heartbreaking. At least they figured out how to communicate like adults eventually. Let me tell you about someone who discovered that their mysterious health problems had the most unexpected source imaginable. I kept getting sick and couldn't figure out why. Turns out my boyfriend was slowly poisoning me with my own vitamins. I'm a 26-year-old woman and I've always been pretty healthy. I exercise regularly, eat well and take my vitamins religiously. But about 8 months ago, I started experiencing these weird symptoms that my doctor couldn't explain. Chronic fatigue, nausea, headaches, and this strange metallic taste in my mouth that wouldn't go away. At first, I thought maybe I was just stressed from work or not getting enough sleep, but the symptoms kept getting worse. I'd wake up feeling exhausted even after a full night's rest, and I'd get these dizzy spells that would hit me out of nowhere, especially in the mornings. I went to 3 different doctors, ran blood tests, checked for allergies, autoimmune disorders, even food poisoning. But everything came back normal or inconclusive. One doctor suggested it might be anxiety. Another thought it could be a vitamin deficiency, which was ironic since I was taking supplements daily. The symptoms followed this weird pattern where I'd feel terrible for a few days, then gradually start feeling better, only to crash again. The cycle repeated every week or two, and I couldn't figure out what was triggering it. I started keeping a detailed journal, tracking everything I ate, drank and did, but no patterns emerged. My boyfriend Trevor was incredibly supportive throughout this whole ordeal. He'd bring me soup when I felt sick, drive me to doctor appointments, and constantly research possible causes online. He even started organising my daily vitamins into those weekly pill containers to make sure I never missed a dose. Trevor had moved in with me about 10 months earlier, and he was always very health conscious. He'd encourage me to take my supplements, remind me when I forgot, and even researched which brands were supposed to be the most effective. He said he wanted to make sure I was taking care of myself properly. The pill organising thing started about a month after my symptoms began. Trevor said he noticed I was forgetting to take my vitamins some days, and that maybe inconsistency was contributing to my health problems. He offered to sort them into daily containers, so I'd never miss a dose, and it seemed sweet and helpful. But I started noticing that my symptoms seemed worse on days when I was really good about taking all my vitamins, which didn't make sense if I was supposed to be deficient in something. Taking supplements should have made me feel better, not worse, but I dismissed it thinking maybe my body just needed time to adjust. One morning I woke up feeling particularly awful, nauseous and dizzy, with that horrible metallic taste stronger than ever. I stumbled to the kitchen to get some water and accidentally knocked over my pill container, spilling the day's vitamins across the counter. As I was picking them up, I noticed something odd about my iron supplement. It looked different from the bottle I'd bought somehow. Darker and with a slightly different shape. I compared it to the pills in the original bottle, and they were definitely not the same. I confronted Trevor about it, and he got defensive, saying maybe the pharmacy had given me a different generic brand, or that lighting can make pills look different. But something in his reaction made me suspicious. He seemed nervous and kept avoiding eye contact. That weekend, while Trevor was visiting his parents, I decided to investigate. I took one of the suspicious pills from my daily container and one from the original bottle to a pharmacy and asked them to identify both. The pharmacist confirmed that the pill from my container wasn't iron at all, but something else entirely. They couldn't tell me exactly what it was without more advanced testing, but they were concerned enough to suggest I contact poison control immediately. I called the number they gave me and explained the situation. The person on the phone told me to save all the pills and contact the police. I spent the rest of the weekend secretly collecting evidence, taking photos of the different pills, documenting the timeline of my symptoms and Trevor's behaviour. I felt like I was going crazy, suspecting my own boyfriend of deliberately making me sick, but the evidence was right there. When Trevor came home Sunday night, I pretended everything was normal. While I figured out what to do, I couldn't confront him directly because I was scared of how he might react. If he really was poisoning me, what else might he be capable of? I made an appointment with a doctor who specialised in toxicology and brought samples of the suspicious pills. Within 2 days, I had confirmation that someone had been replacing my iron supplements with a different medication, one that could cause all the symptoms I'd been experiencing. The medication wasn't immediately life-threatening in small doses, but long-term exposure could cause serious organ damage. The doctor was legally required to report it as suspected poisoning and helped me contact the authorities. The police investigation revealed that Trevor had been systematically replacing several of my vitamins with various medications. Some were things like sleep aids that would make me drowsy and confused. Others were substances that would cause nausea and disorientation. His computer history showed he'd been researching how to make someone sick without killing them and had ordered the replacement pills online using gift cards so they couldn't be traced back to him. He'd been documenting my symptoms in a journal of his own, like some kind of sick experiment. When they arrested him, he initially denied everything, but eventually confessed that he'd wanted to make me dependent on him by making me think I was chronically ill. He thought if I was sick and weak, I'd need him to take care of me and would never leave him. The psychological evaluation revealed he had serious control issues and had done similar things to previous girlfriends, though none had ever figured out what was happening. One ex-girlfriend had been hospitalized multiple times for mysterious symptoms that stopped after they broke up. I had to undergo months of medical treatment to clear the substances from my system and deal with the organ damage, some of which may be permanent. I also needed therapy to process the trauma of being systematically poisoned by someone I trusted and loved. Trevor was charged with assault and attempted poisoning, among other things. He's currently serving a 3-year sentence, but will likely be out in less than 2 years, which terrifies me because his letters from prison suggest he still thinks what he did was justified. I've since learned that this type of abuse is more common than people realise. It's called medical abuse or medical gaslighting, and it often goes undetected because the symptoms seem like legitimate health problems, and the abuser appears caring and supportive to outsiders. Now I live alone again, and I'm extremely careful about my food and medications. I only buy vitamins myself, and I never let anyone else handle them. It's sad that I have to be suspicious of such basic things, but I'm just grateful. I figured out what was happening before it was too late. The most chilling part of this story isn't just that Trevor was poisoning her, but that he was so methodical about it, organising her pills like a caring boyfriend, while secretly conducting experiments on her body. The fact that he'd done this to previous girlfriends and gotten away with it makes you wonder how many other people are out there suffering from mysterious illnesses that aren't mysterious at all. Medical abuse is absolutely terrifying because it exploits the most basic trust we have in the people closest to us. This next story is going to make you question everything you think you know about workplace relationships and the lengths some people will go to for love. My co-worker has been sabotaging my projects for months because she thought it would make me quit and we could be together. I work at a mid-sized marketing firm and I've been there for about 3 years. I love my job most of the time. But this past year has been incredibly frustrating because it seemed like everything I touched turned into a disaster. Campaigns would fail, presentations would glitch, client meetings would go sideways for reasons I couldn't understand. It started small at first. Maybe a file would be corrupted or an email wouldn't send properly, but over the past 6 months, It escalated to major problems. Client presentations would have wrong information, despite me double-checking everything. Campaign budgets would be off by thousands of dollars, and somehow it always traced back to something I'd supposedly done wrong. My boss started questioning my competence, and I was put on an informal performance improvement plan, which was humiliating because I'd always been one of the top performers in my department. I was working twice as hard to compensate for all these mysterious errors, but the harder I worked, the worse things seemed to get. The breaking point came last month when a major client presentation completely fell apart. The slides were filled with placeholder text that definitely wasn't there when I'd finished preparing them the night before, and the budget numbers were so wildly incorrect that the client walked out of the meeting. My boss called me into his office and basically told me that if I had one more major screw-up, I'd be terminated. I was devastated because I knew I wasn't making these mistakes, but I couldn't prove it, and I was starting to doubt my own sanity. Maybe I was more careless than I thought. That's when my coworker Jenna started being extra nice to me, offering to help with projects, staying late to assist with presentations, and constantly reassuring me that everyone makes mistakes and that things would get better. She'd bring me coffee and offer to review my work before important meetings. Jenna had always been friendly, but we'd never been particularly close. She worked in a different department, so our paths didn't cross much until recently, when she'd started finding excuses to collaborate on projects or grab lunch together. I thought she was just being supportive during a difficult time, but I started noticing that the problems with my work only seemed to happen on projects where Jenna had offered to help or had access to my files. She'd volunteer to do final reviews or offer to upload presentations to the shared drive, and inevitably something would go wrong. I decided to test my theory by creating a fake project that only Jenna knew about. I told her I was working on a proposal for a potential new client and asked if she could review it. Before I submitted it, I made sure the document was perfect and saved multiple backup copies. Sure enough, when I went to present the fake proposal the next day, all the financial projections had been changed to ridiculous numbers, and there were spelling errors throughout the document that definitely weren't there before I confronted Jenna about it, and she acted shocked and concerned. But her reaction felt off. She seemed more nervous than surprised. And when I pressed her for details about when she'd reviewed the document, her story kept changing. She claimed she'd only made minor suggestions but couldn't explain how major errors had appeared. I started paying closer attention to Jenna's behaviour and noticed she'd been watching me constantly during meetings, taking notes when I spoke, and seemed to know details about my personal life that I'd never shared with her. She'd make comments about my weekend plans or mention things I'd only told close friends. The truth came out in the most bizarre way possible during our company holiday party. Jenna had clearly been drinking, and she cornered me near the coat check and started this rambling confession about how she'd been in love with me for over a year and had been trying to get me to quit my job. She explained that she'd been sabotaging my work because she thought if I got fired, I'd realise that corporate life wasn't for me, and maybe I'd be open to starting a freelance business with her. She'd been fantasising about us working together as partners in business and eventually in life. Jenna admitted to accessing my computer when I was away from my desk, changing files, deleting emails, and even hacking into my accounts, using information she'd gathered about me. She'd learned my passwords by watching me type, and had been systematically destroying my professional reputation. She seemed to think this was romantic, that she was saving me from a job that was obviously making me miserable and giving us a chance to build something beautiful together. She couldn't understand why I looked horrified instead of grateful for her intervention. I immediately reported everything to HR and provided them with evidence of the sabotage, including the fake project I'd used to test my theory. Jenna was fired within a week, and I had to change all my passwords and security questions because she'd compromised so much of my digital life. The company also launched an investigation into all the projects that had failed and found clear evidence of tampering. They offered me a promotion and a raise as an apology, but the damage to my confidence and reputation took months to rebuild. Jenna tried to contact me several times after she was fired, sending long emails about how she'd only been trying to help and that we were meant to be together. She seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset and kept insisting that she'd done it all for love. I ended up having to get a restraining order because she started showing up at my apartment and my gym claiming she just wanted to explain herself and make things right. She'd created this entire fantasy relationship in her head where we were destined to be together. The whole experience taught me to trust my instincts when something feels wrong and to be more careful about who I allow access to my work and personal information. It's terrifying how much damage one person can do when they have access to your professional life. Jenna destroyed months of my career because she thought sabotaging my job would somehow lead to romance. The level of delusion required to believe that systematically ruining someone's professional reputation is an act of love is genuinely disturbing. She literally watched this person suffer through performance reviews and threats of termination while knowing she was the cause, all while bringing them coffee and pretending to be supportive. That's not love. That's psychological warfare disguised as workplace friendship. Well, folks, we've journeyed through some truly wild territory tonight, from secret guardian angels to underground juggling societies to boyfriends who think noise complaints are flirting and roommates who steal food but leave guilt gifts. These stories remind us that human behaviour is infinitely more complex and bizarre than we could ever imagine. If you've stuck around for all these twisted tales of love gone sideways, consider hitting that subscribe button because apparently you have the same appetite for relationship chaos that I do. And honestly, there's always more where these came from. Thanks for spending your evening diving deep into other people's beautifully messy lives with me. And I will see you in the next one.